An associate professor at American University, April Shelford is an intellectual historian of early modern Europe. Her second book, A Caribbean Enlightenment, Intellectual Life in the British and French Colonial World, 1750 to 1792, is forthcoming with Cambridge University Press.
I want to thank Jeff and Leslie for organizing this panel, and also I do want to thank Dan and Megan for the seminar. It was like absolutely essential to keep me alive intellectually during the pandemic. My remarks are based on what I've learned researching and writing the book that Leslie just mentioned, and I entitle it Enlightenment as Practice. Returning soon to Saint-Domingue, the planter Monsieur Fage apologized for the limitations of the memoir on indigo that he was presenting to a meeting of the Académie Royale des Sciences in Paris on 26 March 1760. It could only clear a path, he said, to useful discoveries whose illumination the colonies anticipate from Académie. He described his own and fellow planters' attempts to answer many questions about processing the plant into a dye, such as, processing the plant into a dye from close observation and experimentation. He urged metropolitan specialists in fields such as chemistry to apply themselves to their difficulties. He assured them that Saint-Domingue's planters would eagerly perform whatever trials the Academy requested. The academicians praised Fage as a good citizen. They even made him a correspondent. But the Academy removed him from its role in 1767 as it heard nothing more from him. Yet if Fage did not keep his promises, neither did the Academy respond to his requests. Fage's memoir is a glimpse into colonial knowledge production. Planters engaging in practices intended to secure answers to their questions, such as trials conducted in the presence of skilled practitioners. When they did, they were participating in the same agricultural enlightenment that inspired metropolitan counterparts and that resulted in an explosion of agricultural treatises and manuals. One by a Saint-Domingue planter reveals Caribbean agriculturalists engaging in yet another intellectual practice, circulating information through manuscripts. After the 7 Years' War, Saint-Domingue had another more public way of sharing information, domestically produced periodicals. Questions posed by editors and readers on cultivating and processing indigo and sugar, introducing new crops and technological innovations, drew in a variety of respondents, not just planters. Everyone cited experience as the basis of their intellectual authority, but more than a few were drawing on the metropolitan publications sitting on their bookshelves. What I have described is an enlightenment made visible through practices. These were undergirded by assumptions about the right to think for oneself, the intelligibility of the human and the natural worlds, and the imperative to pursue and communicate useful knowledge. Though it took a very, very long time for this project to take shape, it began nearly 25 years ago when I was a visiting professor at the University of the West Indies in Jamaica. There in the library, I first turned the pages of Thomas Thistlewood's journals. Seated among staff, students, and faculty, most descendants of the enslaved Africans who produced the lucrative commodities that made France, Britain, planters, and merchants rich. This was several years before Trevor Bernard published Mastery, Tyranny, and Desire, Thomas Thistlewood and his slaves in the Anglo-Jamaican world. It made Thistlewood rightly infamous for his savage punishments of the enslaved and his sexual predations of enslaved women. Yet among terse accounts of appalling acts were Thistlewood's annual book orders from England, records of whom he had lent books to or borrowed from, 4 volumes of transcriptions from the latter, intellectual interactions with the peripatetic naturalists, and cultural activities at neighbors' homes. In short, here was intellectual friendship, a serious reader who saw in books ways of understanding the world and its place in it, and a typical 18th-century amateur who collected weather information, cultivated a garden, and stargazed with telescopes. In other words, Thistlewood participated in Enlightenment intellectual culture, as did several of his friends. Academically, I came from the gentlemanly, erudite world of the late 17th century Republic of Letters, precisely the people that Jeff was talking about and the subject of my first book. So this was a bit mind-blowing, to say the least. Just what did these activities mean to people like Thistlewood and his friends? What did they think they were doing? and why were they doing it? Finding answers to these questions pushed me to search for the Enlightenment in British and French colonial contexts, chiefly in Saint Domingue and Jamaica. But how to proceed? The Caribbean produced no towering intellectuals. It had no intellectual capitals like Paris or Edinburgh. No presses churning out publications, though there are publications, many of them very rare today. I also made life a bit harder for myself by pushing my chronology back to the mid-century. In the end, I have benefited enormously from shifting scholarly approaches to the Enlightenment. As L.W.B. Brockless put it in 2002, scholars' interest, quote, switched from the Enlightenment as an idea to the Enlightenment as practice. This entails, as Bettina Dietz wrote in 2010, turning away from a pure history of ideas in favor of a cultural history of publishing and reading, a social history of intellectual sociability, and the situating of ideas within historical political constellations. Finally, it is to approach the Enlightenment, as Sebastian Conrad put it in 2012, quote, not as a thing. Rather, we should ask what historical actors did with it. What I've already said gives some idea how I began to find Caribbean colonists doing Enlightenment. I stumbled on the Thistlewood papers, which led me to two other war troves of unexplored manuscripts that enabled me to tell larger stories about natural history and intellectual sociability, the histories of the book and of reading in mid-18th-century Jamaica. And here, I have to acknowledge the incredible generosity of the Institute of Jamaica in Kingston and the Bristol Museum's Galleries and Archives in England. For the French, I initially looked to the surfacing of intellectual activity in a variety of archives. These are often documents produced by the rich associational culture of the old regime. The anecdote with which I began comes from the archive of the Academy in Paris. In the colonial archives, I found memoirs of Saint-Domingue's Chambre d'Agriculture, which frequently read like tightly argued treatises. To return to the affiche, my mining it for intellectual content and activity parallels the efforts of scholars studying metropolitan affiche. And I'm thinking about Elizabeth Andrews Bond's very recent book, and there are a few people in this room who have done exactly the same thing. But the affiche had two ephemeral sibling publications during the 1760s, the Journal de Saint-Domingue and the Iris Américaine, both exceedingly rare today. Read together, I saw all three as facets of the same enlightening project. By combining metropolitan material with domestically authored efforts, the affiche and the journal enabled colonists to argue in the intellectually respectable terms of political economy against royal policies. The Iris promoted an ideal of white womanhood. She would civilize her partner through the cultivation of their lettres and the domestication of his passion. Please note, an emphasis on practice in no way excludes ideas. Rather, ideas live through practice, as when the slave-holding parent of a mixed-race child transcribes John Locke's treatise on education, or an experienced refiner peruses chemical works, puzzling out the process in his boilers. In short, I found the Caribbean Enlightenment by finding colonists who were doing it. Physicians, planters, merchants, overseers, military men, publishing entrepreneurs, colonial officials, lawyers, and the rare minister or priest. They engaged in activities typical of Enlightenment intellectual culture for many of the same reasons that people in the metropole did. Diversion, asserting social status by accumulating cultural commodities and cultural capital, sometimes engaging in rigorous investigations. But they made Enlightenment their own by making the Caribbean they lived in an object of knowledge, and by using its intellectual tools to address concerns arising from their social and political contexts. This is an enlightenment of white men, but I want to assure you, I don't think it's the only Caribbean enlightenment story that can be told. Nor is this to dismiss the aspirations of the enslaved or free people of color, or deny their contributions to knowledge production. Far from it. Rather, it reflects an essential feature of the Enlightenment as my subjects practiced it. Exclusion, based in race and gender, was always a point for them. For them, becoming enlightened made a new, distinctive colonial identity available, one that pushed back against metropolitan stereotypes of Caribbean degeneracy and Philistinism, that redrew the line between free and unfree smudged by proximity and intimacy, and that validated on a cultural basis the power to enslave.